You know, that's it. Long before I came to the United States, I had read a lot of American literature. And I felt I knew something about this country because of that, you know, because of everything from Roth and Bellow to Faulkner and Eudora Welty, you know. So I've never been to Russia, actually, apart from a very brief visit. And what I know about Russia, I know from the writing. I know from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Pushkin and Bulgakov and Nabokov and Solzhenitsyn and so on. And Latin America, again, I mean, I had never been to Latin America when I first read Borges and Garcia Marquez and so on. And yet, in reading them, I felt that the world was completely open to me, you know. And then later on, many years later on, I went to South America and discovered that it actually was like that. You know, that they weren't making it up, that it actually was. And this is, I think, the one thing I will say about my writing and the magic realists of South America, which I think people often push together in a way that's not exactly right. But the thing that is true is that we are writing about very weird places, you know, and the weirdness of the writing comes out of the weirdness of the places. And that in many ways, I've always thought about my writing is that it's not magic realism, it's not fantasy, it's understatement. Because the real places are so much more bizarre that you couldn't possibly make them convincing if you wrote them down. So, and I remember when Midnight's Children came out, that people in America and Europe tended to respond to the fantasy elements in the book, whereas people in India read it like a history book. You know, I mean, I recall being, you know, I was much younger. I went to Bombay just after the book came out, and this young guy about my age came up to me, and he said, "You know, I could have written your book. I know all that stuff." and I mean, I took it as a compliment, you know, because what he was saying was that in a way, he's saying what you were saying, which is that the book expressed some kind of shared common knowledge and common experience, you know, and I'm very proud of that. So yes, it's written for you, but maybe one or two other people. Maybe you would lend your copies to one or two other people. Thank you. Yeah, sorry to go up here now, yes.
Yes, this is a follow-on to several of your comments, but it picks up immediately on the previous one. It goes a little bit to the subjective side. But first, a compliment to you. We got to your literature through our teenage children.
Oh, yeah.
They say you're not boring, so we agree.
That's the highest praise. If
in America, it is, yes.
Yeah. No, anywhere in the world that there are teenage children, it is, actually.
So, to the question, in your writings, you have explored a lot of worlds. And you've shared a lot. Do you find yourself in those rare moments of reflection, which I'm sure must overcome you once in a while, do you find yourself looking at your writing as asserting yourself, as asserting a Salmon Rushdie that's there, or do you find yourself defining yourself as where you are? Or is it a loaf of bread, jug of wine, and something else?
No, I think you have to move beyond yourself, you know, I mean, otherwise you're not saying very much about anything. I mean, I think there's a thing that seriously that one tries to do in writing is to find your own, I mean, literally your own sentences. I mean, your sentences that are not anyone else's sentences, and your way of telling a story that is not someone else's way. You know, and it seems to me that if you look at the very, very greatest writers, they are very distinct in that way. You know, only Garcia Marquez is like Garcia Marquez. Only Hemingway is like Hemingway. Only Faulkner can write the sentences of Faulkner. Only Joyce is Joyce. So only Beckett is Beckett, and so on. And so that's, I think, is always a thing that a writer needs to do to find your voice. But then you have to use your voice to do something which is not entirely as solipsistic as your question suggests. You have to look beyond the self at the world, and try and find stories which reflect your engagement with the life and time, with the times you live in, you know, and that's, I mean, I suppose, so even as I say it, it sounds too programmatic, really, because I think really you're just trying to come up with something that captures your imagination and that makes you feel it's worth spending a couple of years digging around in, you know, and it's much less organized a decision than the way I'm describing it, which is more like an afterthought description of it, but it'll have to do for the moment. Thanks.
Good evening.
Okay, these last three then. Okay.
A number of months ago, I went to see Isabel Allende. She was in town, she was speaking, and somebody asked her the question, what motivated you to start writing? And she answered, well, I was very lucky to have a highly dysfunctional family. And it all stemmed from there. And so I want to ask you that question. What motivated you to start writing? How have you developed that ability over time?
Yeah. You don't want to know my family. Well, at least you want to know some of them, but a lot of them. I mean, I had an uncle, to give you an example. I had an uncle who, after the Iranian fatwa was declared against the satanic verses, took out an advertisement in the local newspaper in Rawalpindi in Pakistan to say, essentially, we never liked him anyway. And you know, don't blame us. You know, nothing to do with us. So yeah, I when I was at Cambridge, the provost, the president of my college at Cambridge King's, was a great anthropologist, Edmund Leach, and he gave a famous lecture in England which caused a certain amount of controversy at the time about the family. And its famous opening sentence was, if I remember correctly, what did he say? He said, the family with its narrow privacy and tawdry secrets is the source of all our discontents. And I think that's a wise remark. No, I mean, I didn't really become a writer in order to trash my family, but it was a useful side effect. Yeah, sorry, yeah, go on.
Your early nonfiction work, Imaginary Homelands in particular, was critical of Western society's policies towards the East and towards immigrant groups. And how do you see that work today?
I mean, I think I hope it was correct about the period in which I wrote it, you know, and I think, as I say, that was a collection of essays which were written essentially in the 1980s, between about 1980 and 1991, something like that, I think. The earliest essays may even have been a little earlier than that. And certainly, English society, at the time that I was writing those essays, and at the time that I was writing the Satanic Verses, had a much worse attitude towards immigrant groups. You know, there was a much more racist atmosphere, and it was, you know, it was really a racially tense society. And oddly, I had felt that had improved enormously. You know, and that the kind of intermingling and inter-knowledge, if you like, of those communities had greatly increased. And then of late, of course, given the sort of thing that has been mentioned several times tonight, the kind of growth of Islamic radicalism, that's done something to undermine those improvements. But I don't believe it actually has fundamentally undermined them. I mean, I still think if you look at England as a society, you know, most of it is really very well integrated. And I think the same is true of this country. And I think actually the different communities, including those that have come from Muslim backgrounds, you know, are extraordinarily well integrated, really. So I don't think that one wouldn't write, if you like, quite such a radically critical text now as one wrote then, because there's actually, paradoxically, there's more grounds for optimism now, you know, even though there are the obvious grounds for pessimism. And, you know, underneath that, it seems to me there's a great deal more underlying positive development, you know, and so I think one would have to write in a more complex way now. You have to recognize the reasons why people are disturbed and the things that people are afraid of, you know, which don't need to be rehearsed here because we all know what they are. And underneath that, the very real progress, you know, and I think that's, well, I hope that's as optimistic as I can get anyway. Okay, thank you. And the last question up here.
Hello. You are celebrated as a uniter of East and West, and I'm wondering how storytelling for you relates to your hopes for the world, and if this itself relates to how you choose to begin the writing process with historical fact.
I don't know. I mean, I always hesitate to offer a utilitarian view of literature. Because I think there's something, it's very important to say about books, fiction, that it's useless. It's one of the beauties of this thing is that it's not made for useful reasons. It might accidentally acquire use. I mean, if it's a very big book, you might be able to stand on top of it to reach the top shelf. If it's a very heavy book and you feel angry with somebody, it might become useful as a weapon. But on the whole, books aren't particularly useful. That's to say, they don't have, or at least those books which set out deliberately to have messages and great social projects are very often tedious books. Every so often there's a book which sets out to do something like that and does it without being tedious. And I mean, I guess an example of that would be Uncle Tom's Cabin. But there are relatively few books which have that kind of direct relationship with a social consequence. And I think the way literature does change the world, but I think the way in which it does it is much harder to measure because it does it one reader at a time. It's put it like this, that when you fall in love with a book and it does something to you which is a permanent change, the consciousness of the work of the artist in some way shifts your consciousness, and the way in which you afterwards see the world is to some tiny degree affected by the experience of reading that book. And now it may be that we don't love that many books in a lifetime. It may be that we love 5, or 50, but it's probably not a very, very large number. But those books that we really take to our hearts are books which change us and shape us, and that's, I think, the power of the form. And the great magic of it is that we don't know when it's going to happen. I don't know whether my book will do that to you or to anyone, and you don't know when you pick up a book if that's what's going to happen to you. And it's precisely because it's impossible to predict it that we can have this art form, because it's not essentially didactic. I think a book which sets out to teach you something, a novel which sets out to teach you something, essentially I don't want to read. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.